And hopefully some of the examples that I'll give today will sort of also testify to this notion that we try to imply, really to sort of try and work across the different disciplines and sectors to create more holistic solutions. That's a theme that I will come back to. And this is just the good thing about these maps is that you only need one office in Russia, for instance, to fill a very big part of the map. But this is basically where we are worldwide. And as you can see, there is a concentration in Europe, and in particular in Northern Europe and in Scandinavia. Our headquarters is in Copenhagen, and then also in the US and in some parts of Asia. So I thought that I would start because again the theme of the presentation is how climate change drives urban innovation. So as I was sort of preparing for this, I was thinking a little bit about what is innovation and what is it actually sort of we think about when we think about innovation. And of course there are probably as many answers to that as there are people, but for a lot of people, including for me, innovation is in a way, it looks like this. It has round glasses and a black turtleneck and really sort of is doing cutting edge stuff. And so as I thought about, and actually I have worked also in Ramboll for several years with issues related to innovation also across the entire company. I thought about, what it is that then drives innovation, and sort of Steve Jobs. I think Jobs is obviously a sort of an interesting person and a good role model. And as I looked into, his, and probably some of you know this background was, that I think one of the things that in a way characterized his way of looking at the world and also innovating was to really try to attack the problems from a new angle. So, for instance, in his case, looking at this monster that you have here, the good old-fashioned, well, I don't know if you wanted to call it a computer, and then really sort of saying, okay, what can we do with that? And from what I've sort of read and heard is that he sort of said, okay, what I really want to do is I want to make this thing sexy. And that might sound a little bit weird because that's not normally what you would think, when you look at something like this. It wouldn't be your natural first thing to say, okay, I want to make it sexy. But that was actually what he said that he wanted to do. And so taking that sort of analogy and thinking, okay, what is it actually when you look at a city or an urban space, what is it actually we want to achieve with that? What is it that what is the ultimate aim and goal for all of the things that we want to do in the urban space, in the urban fabric? And of course, you could say sexy might not really fit the bill here, but for me, that would be, I think we would want to make the cities livable. And everything else that we do, in a way, should have that aim and should contribute to that overall objective. And that, I think, is of course something that is to some extent kind of high flying, but nevertheless, I think that is really the equivalent of sexy when you think about computers or phones. That is what we should look at in an urban setting. And I think, increasingly that is what also is the general notion that people are looking at. And I will be, as we proceed, getting back to this issue of livability and what it means, because we've actually spent some time looking into this and trying to understand at a little bit more granular level what is actually livability. And I think it's quite interesting, and it would be interesting also to maybe at the end of, or as we go through it, have some feedback in terms of what would you think about when we talk about livability. So moving to Copenhagen and to Denmark, and I think it's I understand you will be going there also, and I'm very excited about that. It's of course my home country, and it's a very small country, 5.5 million people, and almost so small that you could sort of say, well, is it too small to? I mean, is it anything but a little sort of laboratory for things? How can you sort of, can you transfer anything from Denmark? And I would argue, of course, that you can, but maybe we can also discuss that, and I'll give you some examples. So you probably already know where Denmark is, but I thought I'd better put it on the map and make a big red circle so that there is no confusion here. and as you can see, you know, we're landlocked with Germany for parts of Denmark, but otherwise Denmark is really sort of a country consisting of smaller islands, and then, you know, lots of water all over the place. When you see pictures from Denmark or images, and also I heard parts of the introduction, at least, you know, it's typically very positive pictures that are portrayed. Like, you know, this is from the harbor of Copenhagen, where, you know, a very happy fellow is jumping into the water, because again, the harbor is so clean that you can actually swim in it. It used to be like that, but that is how it is today. And of course, a lot of effort went into getting it to that stage. Another example, the harbor baths. They're actually also open in the winter time, and people do go swimming in the freezing winter. But I don't know if that's our Viking heritage or what it is. But nevertheless, or you will see pictures like this. You know, the typical tourist brochure kind of picture. You know, this little sort of royal kingdom. This is our queen's castle. These are the guards. You know, very, very nice and cozy. This is from the harbor area in Copenhagen, all very neat and touristy. Another, I think, very, very sort of common image from Copenhagen or from Denmark are, you know, all of the people biking, and I'll get back to talk a little bit about also the biking culture and transportation modalities. But these are sort of some of the idyllic images you often will see. But of course, the sun doesn't always shine in Denmark and in Copenhagen. I mean, a large part of the year it's very cold, it's very dark. This time of the year, you know, it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and even before sometimes, and it's sort of the sun doesn't show up until 9 in the morning. So you know, large parts of the year is actually more like this than any of the previous pictures you've seen. And you know, the bike lanes will look like this, and perhaps that sort of testifies a bit again, sort of to the Danish Viking culture, or there might be other things behind sort of this type of mystical behavior, but we can get back to that. So one of the things that you know, I have often faced, and maybe I don't know if that was part of the introduction, but because that was when I had to restart. I moved here to the US about 3.5 years ago as a result of Ramboll, the company that I work for. We acquired a relatively large American company, and I moved over here to sort of oversee that merger. And I have since then also been working with, you know, the whole issue of livable cities and how we could bring some of the things that we do in the Nordics and in Europe to the US marketplace. And I would say often reactions that I've met is there's a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity, but also, you know, back to what I said earlier, you know, is, you know, can you actually take, you know, the experiences and that you have from Denmark? It's such a small place, and the US is such a big country. You know, does size matter in these kind of things? And can US citizens actually learn anything? And there's a spelling mistake, I apologize for that. But can US citizens actually learn anything from Denmark and Copenhagen? I think that's a relevant question to ask, and one we can also, of course, debate. And I would probably, I mean, I would argue yes, but of course you cannot just, you know, transfer things one-to-one. There is, of course, always a need to look at local measures and local conditions and all these kind of things. So before getting to some specific examples, I thought I would also just say a little bit about, you know, urbanization, because, and I think this is probably not new to any of you, that urbanization is one of the mega trends in this world that we are living in. More and more people are moving to the cities, and by 2015, you know, we will have the vast majority of the population on the globe living in the cities. And that, of course, as we also know, puts a lot of pressure on city life and a lot of requirements to how cities are structured, to the urban infrastructure, and lots of other things. And as we are seeing, and I think that's also a trend you can obviously find here in the US, as you can see that that people are moving to the cities and putting this pressure on cities, but also at the same time, cities increasingly being these generators of economic growth and prosperity and innovation and all these kind of things. There is a need, I think, in many places to sort of step back and rethink a little bit how what our approach to urban living should actually be. Some of the urban challenges, and I hope I'm not being sort of too doomsday negative with these. I think these are probably also familiar to you. That in some cities there, and this is maybe more in the developing world, but you have overpopulation. The cities can simply not cope, and that's where you find shanty towns and all of these other kind of sort of irregular urbanization trends. Traffic congestion, I think, is something that is very familiar to a lot of people in the US. I live in Washington, D.C. We're one of the worst cities when it comes to sort of congestion. I actually saw a study a half a year ago that said that D.C. was now worse than LA, and I think that really counts for something. So that is, of course, a huge issue, and also something that there are numerous studies that will tell you how congestion, in terms of also just from an economic perspective, time lost and resources lost, and people just sitting stuck in their cars on highways and roads. Pollution, air pollution in particular, but also noise and light pollution are issues that are very high on the agenda. I think we've all experienced that being in an urban setting, and there are cities, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly also in the developing world, where where it's more or less. They would have days during the year where people are advised not to step outside. So that is increasingly an issue with all of sort of the illnesses and casualties that also comes from that. And then, of course, social issues, being able to cope with all of the, homelessness is something that I think is high on the agenda in a lot of US cities as well, but a lot of other social issues that are following along. Equity is a big theme in a lot of cities also here. Water, energy supplies. A big theme and something some cities are struggling with. I think we've had recent cases like Michigan Flint scandals of water supplies not being of adequate quality, and it's an issue that is well known. And then waste problems. Obviously, more and more people moving into congested urban areas creates a lot more waste. And that is something that needs to be handled probably also in new ways. But of course, cities also, as I said, pose a lot of advantages. They are social hubs, and we human beings are social. We are social by nature, and the cities provide for that. They are engines of economic development and innovation, and in a lot of looking at some of the big US cities, for instance, you would find that if you were measuring their GDP, is substantially higher than a lot of countries in Europe, for that matter. So it's really strong drivers for economic development. And also there are possibilities for cities where you have people living closer together. A lot of possibilities for using resources more efficiently. For instance, one of the examples that I'll talk a little bit about is, district heating. There's also possibilities in terms of being more efficient when it comes to transportation and mobility, having higher degrees of connectivity. And then also, of course, and I mentioned that before, cities as drivers of education and knowledge. And I think this is not a new phenomenon. You will find a lot of cities also here stateside where really the city is in a way developing, or has traditionally developed around a learning institution, a university for that matter. I'm sure you have that same effect also where you are. So really cities have a lot of advantages, and of course the big challenge and the big issue is really to try and harvest as many of these advantages while reducing some of the challenges that I was talking about earlier. So back to this issue of livability and you know what is livability? I'm sure it's a word you've heard before. It's usually sort of thrown out there in when people present and when you maybe read articles or if you go to conferences or whatever else you do. You know, this notion of, you know, we want to have a livable place or a livable city, and just doing sort of a word cloud. You know, on this you will find a lot of different sort of concepts popping up. Sustainability, it's about well-being, health, has to do with the characteristics of a place, you know, adequate service levels, economic development I mentioned before. So a lot of different kinds of notions about what is really livability. We did a research project with a couple of European universities some years back, a couple of years ago, and really sort of tried to take it a little bit deeper in terms of what livability is. And one of the things and one of the findings, and this might be sort of self-evident for you already, but really, you know, looking at the cities that are typically characterized, and there are these livable cities indexes that you will also find sort of floating around. They're characterized by really having a very high degree of a holistic, integrated approach to how the city develops from an economic, from a social, from an environmental, and a spatial perspective. And really sort of they get into a pattern where these driving forces reinforce each other and really sort of strengthens each other and allow things to sort of take a positive track. We worked then also, you know, with some different tools in terms of, you know, trying to also work with cities and say, you know, can we actually come up with some sort of formula for assessing, you know, livability? And the interesting thing is that, again, back to sort of the word cloud that I showed before, that you can actually make some sort of distinction. And we divided basically the notion of livability into two broad categories. One is the standard of living, and these are, in lack of sort of a better explanation, are really sort of the basic, you could say the basic things that needs to be in place in an urban place in a city. You know, there needs to be housing, obviously, there needs to be some sort of environmental quality, you need to have infrastructure, it needs to be safe, you need to have healthcare provision, education, possibly. These are kind of things that, you know, we can sort of, they're quite tangible. You can set, you know, you can measure, do we have them, and, you know, how are we doing, and these kind of things. So that's sort of what we would call standard of living. But typically that's not enough, because if you ask people, you know, what, you know, do you feel that you are in a livable place or in a livable space? They will typically refer to a lot more sort of a lot of intangible elements as well. You know, do I feel happy in this place? Can I exercise my spiritual beliefs? Is it, you know, family friendly? How does it sort of comply with my psychological well-being and you know, general happiness and these kind of things? So a little bit more sort of intangible in many ways, but typically these are much more important and will be sort of dominating when people sort of evaluate whether a city is livable or not. Another thing that we're looking at is also to really say, based on this, it doesn't actually make sense to sort of in a way think that you can measure, or I would say you can measure maybe, but you cannot compare livability from necessarily from one city to the other, because it is very much local and based on local conditions and local sentiments. So, for example, what constitutes livability in Copenhagen might not be the same as what is livability in New York, as what is livability in Udaipur in India. And that is simply to do with some of these factors that people will assess these things and the importance of these factors quite differently from place to place. And you will also, you know, some of you probably know that, for instance, if you look at something like happiness, you have many examples of people feeling very happy in places that we would think, are very poor or very desolate. But that's because there are a lot of other factors, of course, that influence happiness other than the economic, for instance. So it's sort of the same notion that livability is much more than sort of the tangible and physical infrastructure that we might put in place in a city, but something that is more intangible, and also that it varies a lot from place to place, and you have to take a very place specific approach when you try to define or look at what is livability in this place, and also deriving from that, how can we improve or work with livability for that matter. Another thing that we've been looking at, and I think also where the examples I will give you from Copenhagen, where Copenhagen has perhaps excelled quite a lot in recent years, is really to move away from the silo thinking to taking a much more holistic approach to urban living and to urban development. And you will find, those of you who are working in cities or with cities, as in many other places in life, we tend to sort of be comfortable within the space that we know, and for sure in a lot of urban settings and in cities there are a lot of silos, and so, for instance, Parks and Recreation, they will do their thing. The Department of Environment, so will have their plans and they will do their thing and have their own budget, and so forth and so forth, and really not collaborating a lot unless they are forced to it. And what we have found over the years working in this sphere is that there is so much to be gained from trying to sort of, at least every once in a while, breaking down some of these silos and taking this more holistic approach to the urban setting, and factoring in the things also mentioned here: technical issues, social issues, back to my points before about livability, and cultural competences. So one of the examples that I thought I would share with you was, again, back to also some of the earlier slides I showed of pictures from Copenhagen, really around water, and how the city of Copenhagen have transformed the harbor from an industrial outlet, more or less, to a place where we now have people swimming, and there is a lot of recreational use. The harbor of Copenhagen used to be a harbor like in many other cities across the world, where that's where you had all of the industry, and it was, the water was highly polluted. But the city has then taken active measures to actually try and turn this around. I think I don't think you can see that is actually what is also happening in a lot of places here in the US, that people are increasingly realizing the value of the harbor fronts and trying to find new use and redevelop those areas. But that's a more recent trend. In some parts of Copenhagen, this is an example from the southern harbor. This has resulted in completely new developments, as you will see here, and really, looking at making sure that these developments, these houses, have direct access to the water. This is, of course, maybe a little bit more of an extreme case here. You will see, people having their kayaks just outside their windows and being able to sort of access the water directly. But nevertheless, that is part of the philosophy that we need to sort of bring back the notion of living with water and water as a sort of an asset rather than a liability, and I'll get back to that a little bit later in the presentation. So looking at the climate change, and that was what I sort of started off with, how can climate change really drive urban innovation? I think the first case I would like to look at, or example I would like to give, is really when it comes to energy, and what not only Copenhagen actually, but what Denmark has done to try and mitigate our energy consumption and also mitigate our CO2 emissions as a very important goal. Copenhagen, some years back, and we worked with them to devise this plan, came up with a very bold plan I actually think that there is a mistake here in the year. It should say 2025, but it was to become CO2 neutral by 2025. And it is the first city in the world that will that has such a sort of ambitious goal, and possibly also this first city that will reach it. I think the next one to get to that is Oslo in Norway, that has set a goal by 2030, and a lot of other cities have subsequently followed along. That getting to sort of that sort of ambitious goal, of course, took a lot of work and a lot of analysis, and there was a lot of planning was done, specifically for climate planning and for reducing emissions and moving to this carbon neutral city. And here's an overview of, basically sort of the high level elements of the plan. And here's the right year. And as you can see, the idea is really to move to a substantial reduction in, or maybe I should put it the other way around, to increase the energy, the renewable energy part of the energy consumption. Largely, as you can see from here, from wind energy, but also by increasing the energy consumption using biomass via combined heat and power plants, using at various waste measures to a less extent, and then conversion to biomass via peak production. But really, the big push is around wind energy, and this is. We're not able to show this on a Copenhagen scale, so I took some numbers along from Denmark, really sort of showing, as you can see here, the total energy consumption is kind of stable. The latest numbers I had here was from 2013, but the trend is the same as we look at it now. That the gross energy consumption is more or less stable over the years and has been since the early 1990s. But at the same time, the CO2 emissions, as you can see, have been reduced quite dramatically, and that is, of course, due to this conversion that we've gone through over the years. And as you can see, it's also a gradual slope. So it's not something that is done in one big bang, so to speak, but by sort of a continued, persistent effort over many years. I took this along the GDP projection also, just to show because a lot of times when you discuss sort of the issue of energy usage and moving, for instance, to renewable energy, there is this notion that this is going to be very expensive. It will affect our economic performance and so forth. I think this shows, of course, in quite simplistic terms, that for Denmark, it's actually been an excellent business case to move towards renewable energy. And of course, there are a lot of other features that will affect your GDP in overall terms. But if you look at it at a more granular level, it's actually quite obvious that moving to renewable energy and all of the economic development that has come from that, in terms of new industries, job creation, investment in research, all these kind of things, has really also had a very positive economic impact. So I think one of the takeaways that I just want to say here is that it is actually, as we look at it, can be, if it's orchestrated in the right way, a very attractive economic proposition also to make this green conversion. And I think these days, as I think this is no news, as some of the renewable energy sources are also getting increasingly cheaper, the business case will, of course, improve. The transformation of the energy system in Denmark is of course, and I think the previous slide in a way actually sort of indicated that, is something that has not happened overnight. Obviously, it's been a long journey, and It was actually started back in the early 80s when we had the oil crisis, and Denmark was really hit hard back then. I remember as a kid, growing up, and we had car-free Sundays. There were no cars at all on the streets because that was sort of the verdict from the government. So we really took a hard toll there, and I think that was in a way a wake-up call also for the Danish government at that time, to sort of say, well, we really had to sort of do something drastically, or at least look at some more some different measures. What this picture or this slide actually shows you is the transformation that has taken place over these 30-something years, and really sort of moving from a place where we had these very large power plants. Those are the small, the red dots on the left side that would typically be located, in outside of the urban areas, and then with long transmission lines but relying on that setup, to a system today, which is a much more granular system with many more sort of decentralized energy sources, and also everything now tied together by a very comprehensive district energy and cooling net all over Denmark. So it's just to sort of, in a very brief way, show you that transition that we have been through, and it's been a journey. In Copenhagen, and again, the district energy system in Copenhagen is also in place, and is one of the largest district heating systems in the world. And it by now it supplies, as is also stated here, low carbon heat to more than 1 million people, in a combination of, based on a combination of sources from windmills to waste to energy, to bio fuel stations and so forth. So a very comprehensive system that has now been put in place. And in this case, the district energy system is really sort of the backbone of the livable city, and this is just a way to sort of try and illustrate that, how everything is connected, heating, cooling, and you have the different features, as you can see here, the biomass plants, the offshore wind farms, the solar heating, everything in a way sort of tied together in a very tight system. This is how it looks from one of the beaches. Copenhagen has several beaches in sort of the vicinity of the city, and the interesting thing here is that these offshore wind mills are co-owned by the citizens of the city. I mean, I have shares. A lot of citizens have shares, and they are generally, there has been virtually no objections to putting up these windmills. And I'm saying this because I know that there are several places, at least on the U.S. East Coast at the moment, where there are considerations for offshore wind and a lot of objections. But it's the typical not in my backyard type of syndrome. But in Denmark, I think most people look at these and just think, this is so nice. What a fantastic view! It provides us with clean energy, and if I have shares, even better. So we haven't had the same kind of heated debate over these the windmills as you will find it in other places. This is another example. It's just a new waste to energy facility that we are putting up in Copenhagen. This is also again very close to the city center, and in this case, we had some very good architects, Bjarke Ingels Group, big architects, you might have heard of them, that came along, with this, I think a little bit crazy plan at the time, but basically to build a ski slope on top of the waste to energy facility. And the interesting thing about that, it took, of course, a little bit, because that doesn't make it necessarily cheaper, but the brilliance with that was that by the Copenhageners, this new waste to energy plant is really, looked at as a fantastic new feature. Copenhagen, Denmark is flat, and so is of course Copenhagen. And now there will be a ski facility just, very, very close to the city center. So everyone is looking forward to this new facility going up. And on top of that, some of the newest technology is being used, so it is a very, very clean plant that is being developed. It will go live late this year, I believe. Another example I wanted to talk about in terms of climate change and mitigation is mobility, because that's typically also very high on the agenda for most cities, including also Copenhagen. And again, back to sort of the plans for carbon neutrality. As you can see here, a large part of the plan is, of course, the energy production, but about 11% of the plan of the reduction is actually going to come from sort of green mobility measures, largely moving away from especially fueled cars and to a lot of other measures. But I can talk a little bit about that. So mobility is a big part of the climate, how Copenhagen is addressing climate issues. And again, this is, I think, a point that I wanted to make. This is, biking is a big part of that strategy, the mobility strategy of Copenhagen. And again, biking is not a new phenomenon in Copenhagen. People have been biking for centuries, and so what the city has had to do, I think, is more a matter of trying to sustain and further develop and encourage that culture that in fact was more or less already there. So today, just to put a little bit of numbers on it, Copenhagen has about 540 kilometers of bike lanes. 55% of the Copenhagers use their bike to get to work, and 85% of the people in Copenhagen own a bike. So it's quite, it's really a big part of how people get around in the city. For 60% of Copenhagen, the bikes is their main mean of transportation. So they will, typically choose the bike over any other type of transportation. And 75% of the Copenhageners bike all year round, whether it rains or snows or whatever. And also more interestingly, 28% of the families who have 2 children or more, they have these cargo bikes. There's an example here that are basically used to sort of transport children to and from kindergartens, and you can fit 2 or 3 children into these cargo bikes, and even your shopping bags and so forth. So there are a lot of those bikes in Copenhagen, and by families, these are used as the main mean of transportation. Of course, in order to sort of sustain this biking culture and really trying to increase also biking in Copenhagen, the city has invested quite substantially in biking infrastructure, and I think that's also sort of an important sort of notion to make, that of course this does not come out of nothing, and as more and more people are biking, actually, it is important to develop new infrastructure. This is an example of a bridge in a new developed area in the harbor, where a sort of a dedicated bike lane bridge has been put in place, and really sort of connecting different parts of the city together. Another measure that Copenhagen has been looking at in recent years and is now instituting is really sort of say, because we have, as I showed before, very high percentages of people that are biking in the city, living in the city and biking around in the city center. But one of the big problems that Copenhagen is facing, as many other cities are facing, is that people from the suburbs or from outside of Copenhagen are commuting into the city center in their cars, and that is what is causing a lot of congestion in the city also, and in and out of the city. So more recently, the city has been building, or is in the process of building, these so-called super cycle highways, really trying to sort of develop this more granular net of bike lanes that are connecting also the suburban areas with the city center along the paths that people would normally commute, and have cycle highways that will allow you to just basically in one go move very fast from A to B. So that of course includes also, you know, dedicated bridges over road crossings and a lot of other measures. And I think, you know, generally in terms of sort of the city planning, you know, really taking sort of making sure that you make biking an attractive option, and also, you know, that for instance little things like, you know, the traffic lights. We have dedicated traffic lights for bikes, and they're sort of tuned so that, you know, that you will have a rhythm that will allow people to sort of continuously bike and not stop all the time. But also, you know, measures like you can see here, where, you know, you make it safe to bike in the evening by having different types of light features that will light up as people, you know, approach, for instance.
Mette?
Yeah.
How does Copenhagen or Denmark fund its bike infrastructure?
This is all funded by tax money. And so the city, all of the biking infrastructure is more or less funded by the city of Copenhagen. They have had a very aggressive strategy in terms of getting more people onto bikes and getting the cars out of the city. And of course, as you move into sort of the suburban areas, then you get into sort of its more regional type funding. We also have, you know, Greater Copenhagen Area Region. And it's co-funding by some of the city or sort of the municipalities along the way. But it's all of the funding is public funding one way or the other. I don't know if that answered the question.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. But we have also done, for instance, studies on, you know, you could say looking at sort of the socio-economic benefits of biking, and it's quite astounding because, you know, if you start to factor in issues related to health or reduced pollution, sort of general, sort of just the fact that people are moving around and the exercise and all these kind of things, it really becomes a very attractive business case also for the city. So it has actually not been very hard for the city to find the money, because there's been a general across the different perspectives of political life, a general agreement that this was a very good strategy, and it made good sense also for many purposes. One thing, of course, we've had to deal with is that you have a lot of bikes across the city. So also sort of finding new ways to sort of get rid of your bike when you're not using it. So you know, and this might sound very banal, but it is a real issue in Copenhagen to have enough parking space for bikes, and so that is also being dealt with. And then I think also again back to my earlier point about, you know, Copenhagen being very cold and very dark for a large part of the year. A little thing, but very importantly, you know, when it snows in Copenhagen, the bike lanes are the first that gets cleared of snow before the streets and before anything else. So it's really to make sure that, you know, that there is no excuse for not using your bike. And that is, of course, a very sort of conscious decision that has been made to prioritize bikes and bike lanes over a lot of other infrastructure. But of course, it is also in combination with other types of public transportation. There's been a massive build out of the metro system, something that we've also been involved in, and is still being built out, which you will see when you visit Copenhagen. And also, for instance, you know, features like electrical buses and so forth. That's all part of the sort of the plan for mitigating emissions from transport in the city. Another interesting thing is also that the city has very much used the transportation and putting in place infrastructure as a way to drive economic growth, in the sense that in many places, because a lot of the land in and around the city is owned by the city itself, and so in a very, to sort of explain this in a very simple way, what they have done is that they have then created a special vehicle for urban development. This is sort of a public-private type. It's not really private, but it's sort of a special vehicle for the city, which in some cases have put in place new metro lines, for instance, in new developed areas. That in turn has meant that the value of the land that the city owned in these areas have gone up. So they've been able to sell it for much higher prices than they would have otherwise. And that earning has in a way gone back and then, you know, paid for some of the infrastructure. So it's sort of this is very simplistically explained, but rather than what has happened in other urban areas where the city owns land and then they sell off, they sell off land to finance infrastructure. In this way, the city did it the other way around and harvested the increased property value of the land because the infrastructure was there. And this is an example we can of course dive into, but I think that's quite interesting, and it is now. It's being copied in many places.
Mette, I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
We live in a city of about 210,000 people, Des Moines.
Yeah.
With the 11 associated suburbs, about 500,000 total.
Yeah.
I have someone in the class who is in our area rapid transportation system, so she may have to correct my statistics. But we have approximately 2.5% to 3% of our urban residents in Des Moines that use mass transit on a regular basis. Not long ago, the group went to Freiburg, Germany. Mass transit was within 5-minute walk from every location in the regional area, and 75% of the people regularly use mass transportation. Culturally, how do you bring about that shift? When I look at bicycles, it's impressive. But I also know there's an awful lot of resistance when we put in bike lanes and try to accommodate them. How did you overcome that?
Well, I think first of all, it is a journey, of course, and I can give you examples. Like we have some major streets in Copenhagen that, for instance, were just in recent years, where basically, it's shut down for cars and then turned into only for mass transit, in this case, electrical buses and bikes and with extended bike lanes. And when that idea was launched, first, there was a lot of resistance, of course, for basically the people that were using that particular stretch of street for moving out and about, but also from the local retail, who sort of felt that would completely destroy the flow through the street and the retail and basically their economic foundation. So what the city did in this case was they said, okay, we'll try it. We'll do a trial period, where we will just for, I can't remember how long, I think 6 months or maybe it was less, but for a certain period, they closed off this relatively long, and it was a main artery in the city of Copenhagen, main thoroughfare. We closed it off, and we put, just by very easy measures, have bikes using it and then our buses, and then see how it goes. And then, of course, monitor and study it. And what was found was that, rather than for instance, retail being reduced, it actually went up quite dramatically. One of the simple explanations was that, people, riding their bikes are more easily, or were more likely to sort of get off their bike and stop and go into a shop. And if they pass something that looks interesting, they will stop and get off their bike. So those were some of, you could say, the more anthropological observation that was made as part of this, but it was a very sort of, you could say, simple measure. There was a lot of resistance, but the case actually proved that it was very beneficial for the local, for all of the shops in that particular quite long stretch. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just, I think in some cases, one tactic is exactly like that, to try on a sort of preliminary basis or a non-permanent basis to try some of these things off and see how it works. Because of course, there will also be uncertainties. I know I live here in DC, and one of the things I can see that the city is trying now is, again, one of the main thoroughfares on M Street down in Georgetown. They have, in the weekend, they've simply put up these sort of plastic cones along sort of the street, narrowing basically taking away one lane on each side and making room for bikes and pedestrians. So it's just, these orange, plastic cones that you will find at any sports field that they're using to basically test, and I'm sure that, they're studying the behavior of people, and also, having discussions with all of the shops along, the streets, M Street here in Georgetown to see, whether it has an impact or not, or whether it's positive or not. So I think, that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, to work towards providing good alternatives. I mean, I think your example was, or good public transit alternatives. And I think, you mentioned Freiburg and also sort of the 5-minute concept. And my next example from Copenhagen is actually also that the 5-minute city. And it's very, purposeful that this particular part of Copenhagen is being designed so that nowhere are you more than a 5-minute walk from a public transportation option. So, you need to make it attractive and easy for people to choose the public or the mass transit option over getting into your car, because we're all humans. Otherwise, you will get into your car. That is the easiest and most comfortable choice. And of course, I know mass transit is in some cases it's not the easy solution, but in the long run, and we have many examples of that, it is actually the better economic solution and the better business case. I hope that answered to some extent your question.
Thank you, ma'am.
So going to this case, this is North Harbor in Copenhagen, which is a new development area. This used to be a harbor area that was actually much smaller. This is a rendering you can see here of a plan we helped the city with. But actually a lot of it is also then being filled in land from sort of also the harbor being sort of excavated up in some places, and sediments then being used to sort of fill in and make more real estate available, basically. And as you can see on this drawing, there's a lot of water. These are sort of the dark thoroughfares are canals, and then there's a loop, which is basically a metro loop. And again, the concept here, as I sort of briefly said before, is this 5-minute city, that everywhere in this urban area, you have no more than 5 minutes to an attractive public transportation option in the form of a bus or a metro line, or it could also be bike sharing for that matter. But really, and just again to sort of explain a little bit about sort of the mechanics of how sort of we as planners would have gone about this, is to say, well, the basic principles that we have applied here is that it's very easy, straightforward to get around on your bike. It's very easy, it's very fast. And the same if you choose a public transportation option in the form of a metro or a bus. It's certainly we're not forbidding people to take their cars into this part of the city. That's allowed, but the way the roads are laid out makes it less attractive. It takes more time. You have to drive around, move around corners and all that, and it simply is, for that matter, just less attractive. So it's a very sort of strong signal to say we would actually prefer you to use one of the more, also from a climate sort of climate mitigation perspective and a CO2 perspective, one of the more attractive alternatives. And I think increasingly these are principles that are being applied in many other places. I just wanted to mention also, give you an example of something that is perhaps not directly related to climate and CO2 emissions, but just I put it in there because I know that for instance that here in the US, and certainly it is also an issue in Denmark, but there is a lot of debate around sort of social equity and the social infrastructure of the city. So this is basically an example from Copenhagen, and what you can see is a sort of an aerial photo of one of the neighborhoods in Copenhagen. It's called Nørrebro. This is a neighborhood which has a very large concentration of immigrants from many parts of the world, and has also had a lot of social issues, a lot of issues in terms of safety, security, and so forth. And what the city did in this case, with the help of some really good architects, was to go in and say, well, how can we look at the urban fabric and the infrastructure in a new perspective, and really try to also work with the population we have in this part of the town, to create something that is both sort of appealing and attractive, innovative in some instances, but also is something that they feel some sort of ownership to. So in this case, it's called Super Kiele. It has the features also of climate mitigation, in the sense that you will find that, as you can see here on the left, there is part of the whole biking infrastructure across the city. So new bike lanes were put in place, really sort of connecting one part of the city to the other. But also really a lot of work was put into working with the population in terms of what did they want out of this particular space, and some I think quite interesting features in terms of, because you have here in this part of the city many different nationalities. So what they actually did was that they talked to the people about what they wanted to see there, and they even went to different places of the world and put in benches from countries in Africa. There is a sign here from Russia, and features coming from all over the world that are basically the home countries of the immigrants living in this neighborhood. So it's small things, but what we found from this particular, you could say, urban development, was that going through these measures of involvement and also recognizing and working with the population there has actually meant that there is the operation and maintenance costs of this particular part of the city is lower than in many other parts, basically because the population there has a lot of affinity for the place and takes responsibility for little things like using the trash can when you throw away your trash or whatsoever. And also the in terms of we can measure sort of improvements in terms of safety and general sort of use of the public space. These are some of the other features, really trying to have room for all. Was sort of the tagline for this development. I don't know how I'm going on time, but I would like to give you this. I think it is probably one of the last examples, but it's basically looking at climate change, but more on the adaptation side. And again, sort of going back to where I started with water. And I don't know, this word that I have up here, cloudburst, might sound a little bit strange to you, but it actually is what we have had in Copenhagen in recent years, and I'll give you some examples. We have had the clouds bursting. I think you would probably, in proper English, call it sort of massive rainfalls or something else, or excessive. What is it? There is a sort of a more scientific term for it. But in any way, we've called it cloudburst, and it's actually sort of a direct translation of what you would call it in Danish. And it's more or less a concept that is now being sort of exported to other parts of the world, including to the US, as I'll get back to. So sort of starting off with this notion of water, I think we have over the years, and I think you'll find it also in many US cities, the cities turn their back to water. The buildings were not facing the water. Water was put into big concrete canals. It was put under level. These kind of things. Really, doing away with the water in many ways, and seeing water more as a liability than an asset. And I think what we've seen in Copenhagen is really sort of a change in general sort of perception that the water, thinking about water differently, can actually turn it from a liability into a real asset. But it took actually also some I would say catastrophic events in Copenhagen, similar to what cities are experiencing here in the US. We had these cloudbursts in Copenhagen in 2011 and 2012, where we had over these, in 2 years time, we had three what we would call 100-year events. Massive flooding, lots of rain pouring down, and excess damages due to this excessive rain. Infrastructure critically affected, even to the point where the main hospital of Denmark and of Copenhagen was very close to losing sort of very critical power supplies for extended periods, which of course would have had detrimental effects on people being treated in the hospital. So I think, and it was massive, causing a lot of disruption also, of course, across the city, and a lot also for private citizens. So this was really in many ways sort of a wake-up call and a game changer, and it sort of incentivized the city to go ahead and develop what we would call sort of a cloudburst management plan, really to look at, in a new way, how could we handle all this water that we knew, that we had experienced was coming, and that we could see also from the projections that we have will continue to be an issue. And these are just some photos showing you, again, as I said, infrastructure, trains, streets, massive insurance or economic impact from to insurance companies and so forth. Actually, in this case, also the insurance companies turned around to the city and really put a lot of pressure on the city also to deal with it, because they had to, consecutive years in a row pay out huge sums in private insurance claims as a result of this. So the city, yeah.
On that topic with the insurance companies, and I was going to ask you this anyway, so it's pretty timely. we're sitting in a capital for the U.S. for insurance companies here, and I'm wondering how you've seen insurance companies engaging with communities on implementing resiliency actions in cities to reduce the impact of future climate events. Is it a policy side? Do you see them actually investing financially? How do you see the insurance industries partnering with cities?
So in the case of in the case of Copenhagen, the city, let me put it this way around. I think what is happening in many places, unfortunately, is that you will see, as you have these weather events increasingly, hitting the cities, and of course, more and more claims going to the insurance companies. By default, a lot of insurance companies are in a way just, they see this more or less as a business opportunity, because they increase their premiums, and also they, advocate for more people getting onto insurance schemes, because, that's just the a sort of a necessity. Of course, in many places, what we see is that it also creates, again, sort of an almost like a sort of an economic or an equity divide between the people that can afford insurance and those that cannot. So I think that's one trend. I actually do not have, but maybe I haven't looked thoroughly enough, examples of insurance. I think it's actually sort of, in a way, an untapped potential, and I hope it will go that way, that the insurance industry will start to maybe also look more at sort of preemptive measures and getting into the game differently. But it's actually we do have we're doing some research at the moment together with for instance the Blue or Green Ribbon Commission from Boston and some other key players in terms of looking at climate adaptation financing in the US, and one of the factors we are looking at is the insurance industry and insurance money, and how we might sort of tap into that. But I think it's still early days. What Copenhagen did was, and I'm actually not sure how much this was sort of spelled out or how formalized this was, but they sort of made a deal with the insurance industry that if the city went in and invested heavily in this, the insurance industry, they would not raise their premiums, because that's another issue. And so in this case, that is what we've seen in Copenhagen, is that there has been not the projected increase in premiums because the city has actually gone in and tried to deal with this. There's a lot of you can look in many ways in terms of because and I think that is perhaps also one of the differences between Europe, and in particular Northern Europe or places like Copenhagen and a lot of US cities, in terms of the whole issue of how do you finance these kind of things, and who picks up the bill versus who gets the benefits. And I think we come in Copenhagen and in Denmark from a tradition where the public sector we have a much larger public sector overall, and a different tradition of also the public sector, basically intervening and paying these things, but also a different tradition in terms of, people paying higher taxes, and being willing to pay taxes. So back to the example of Copenhagen, and I will get back to it as I go through this, but one of the way Copenhagen is financing what is going on now is actually by increasing the utility bills, the water bills for that matter. So there's a whole setup around this that you can sort of start to study. And I know you cannot transfer necessarily those financing mechanisms to the US marketplace, because everything, or a lot of things, are quite different over here. But that, of course, doesn't mean that you can try to look at new and innovative ways of financing these. And I think there is work being done in many places to try and get more stakeholders on board and look at these things.
Maybe one more question or comment.
Yeah.
We had we had that downpour this year in places like Houston, Texas. It got close to 50 inches of rain in a 8-10 hour period. We have national insurance programs through FEMA, Federal Emergency Management.
Yeah.
And the incentive to actually plan for these catastrophic or 200 or 500 year events is really minimal. So when you look at what we're going to expend in order to just deal with the damages in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida, some of the Gulf Coast, and Houston will be close to $500 billion.
Yeah.
And nothing has been fixed. When we had the Sandy storm, where we had the surges off the Atlantic Ocean, we had estimated 20 years ago that we could have remedied that problem by spending about $8 to $10 billion. The cost for that surge was $65 billion.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure hasn't changed one iota.
No.
So we're making these massive investments and not remedying the problems. And so now some insurance companies, for example, in Florida, in high risk areas, say, we're out of your market.
Yeah.
If you want to build in these areas, you're going to assume the risk.
And I think it's I think you will also, at least what I hear is that they're sort of popping up. You will find cases of perhaps insurance companies, but also private citizens suing cities, for instance, or suing public authorities altogether for not, putting in place the remedies, as you say, when they know that you could put in place mechanisms that could prevent some of these things. So I think it's obviously, as you point to, it's a very complex system. It's also complex in Denmark. I won't sort of lie to you on that, but I think it is even more complex over here. because of the way the system is built, and because of also the tendency, I think, to maybe I'm making too much of a sort of a claim here, but I think there is a tendency to have a more short-term approach to a lot of things. And for instance, what I sort of also observed, also having talked to sort of colleagues and others, for instance, now you mentioned, the Gulf Coast, is that money will readily flow in once you have a catastrophe, and you can get some rebuilding done. But for instance, issues related to operation and maintenance, simply, maintaining these structures as you move along is not really thought into any budgets, or you think that seems quite stupid, but at least that's what I heard from places like, New Orleans, that, that you had all of these funds, coming in after the big floodings there. You build the big levees, the pump stations, everything, and it's just completely kicked out the bottom of the public or the city's financing, because maintaining these systems are hugely expensive, and that was not really sort of part of the overall thinking. And so I think there's a lot of repeating mistakes, and not really taking that, as I said earlier, that more long-term approach to things, and the more holistic approach. And then also, when you do your calculations in terms of what, and I'll give you some examples here from Copenhagen in terms of the approach that we took. The cost in most cases, and we have done looked at these things in many places, not only in Denmark, but also, in other areas, like when it comes to environmental degradation and things like that in the Middle East and in other places. In almost every case, the cost of doing nothing far exceeds the cost of doing something. And I think that's sort of worthwhile remembering when you look at these kind of things. But of course, it sort of demands that you take sort of a longer sort of time perspective on things, and you do a more holistic sort of socio-economic analysis of whatever intervention and the investments that you want to make. So I think there's still a long way to go in many places in order to sort of really put in your thinking and your mechanisms, your planning mechanisms, your financing mechanisms, and all these kind of things in the right form, and gear it towards these things. I don't know if it made sense, but
Thank you.
But just again, and please, I don't know how much time do I have still. I know you wanted some time in the end also to.
Yeah, I think we have about 5 minutes left, or 7 minutes left on the Skype meeting that's set up. So I'm not sure what's going to happen to us at that point. I'm a little Skype novice.
Okay, so I'll speed ahead, but basically sort of then say, for Copenhagen, when we had these massive rainfall events, really the main thing was to get the rainwater away from the streets, at least from the main streets, because that's where the urban mobility was, or the transportation was really highly impacted. And then of course also from basements, because it caused a lot of damage. And as you can see from this picture, this is a typical street in Copenhagen. You have a lot of basement property. People don't live there, but you will have shops, or you will have storage and all sorts of other things. So what we actually did in this case was really to sort of go back and look at what is the natural flow of water in the city. So a lot of hydraulic modeling was done, looking at landscape. Where do you have sort of the landscape moving up and down? Looking at infrastructure, which are the main streets, for instance. In this case, going forward, you want to avoid having water in the main thoroughfares, but maybe leading the water into streets that will have a smaller impact. Looking at topographies, flooding patterns, flow paths, and all these kind of things. And then also really, putting some emphasis on how, how does water actually flows. And that's one of the things with water. It does not stop, for instance, with the city limit. So very early in the process, it became obvious that, this could not only be something that could be dealt with by Copenhagen, but actually also had to include the neighboring municipalities. This picture from the left is from our Liverpool Cities lab, where we have people that are really sort of working very hands-on with, water flows and these kind of things. And learning from nature. Nature actually has a pretty good sort of hand on how, how to deal with water and how how things flow. So in very broad terms, the strategy that was devised was to follow this sort of finger structure and really have, as you can see here, water going in between. This is the blue connectors here, in between the main thoroughfares, and try to lead it then into some of the lakes we have in Copenhagen that could be then used for retention purposes before the water was more slowly let out into the harbor. One of the problems we had, and I think you'll find that in many places where you have flooding, is that of course your traditional sewer cannot cope with these massive water, and then you sort of have overflow problems, pollution problems, all kinds of things that comes with that. So the tactic here is really to sort of guide the water in ways that you would want it to flow and retain it in the city landscape, in parks, in lakes, and so forth, before you slowly release it into the sewers, and in our case out in the harbor. And we then divided the whole city into catchments. This is maybe more technicalities. Work with cloudburst toolkits, basically cloudburst streets, retention streets, green streets, these kind of things. And then of course also adding, in some cases we had to also extend the do the gray solution, extend the sewers and the channels. But the overarching strategy here was also really much, very much to look at what we call blue-green infrastructure. So really, using the existing cityscape, using parks and so forth to sort of capture the street. One of the things that we look at here, again, also from sort of an economic perspective, was if we go about the strategy of using primarily blue-green infrastructure as sort of our main strategy. What kind of additional benefits can we be looking at? And these are some that sort of are listed here. Improved recreational spaces and recreational value, increased by biodiversity, health benefits, better microclimate, better synergy with traffic planning, and a lot of other things you can look at in this connection. So I'll very quickly just run you through. These are some renderings, and these things are now being put in place. This is an example of a green street. And here again, when it rains, you manage to then capture the water in the middle of the street rather than what would naturally have, the streets flow, the water flows out in the sides. This is a bigger street, sort of a boulevard in Copenhagen, where you have then, you want to maintain the traffic in the middle, and therefore you sort of make sure that the streets is designed in the way that the water flows, along the street, but not again getting too close to the building stock. And another example from again capturing water in the middle of the street. And this is a rendering. There's a sort of a series of lakes in Copenhagen. So this is what is now also being put in place actually, where this lake is a central retention area for a large part of the city. Down in the sort of left-hand corner is where you have the connection to the sort of central sewer system, and where the water is being let out and underneath out into the harbor. But really, again, working with the urban space. In this case, the lake is being, the depth of the lake is being increased, and some of the lake is being filled up, so that you have a green space, and then when it rains, you can sort of capture the water in this way. So a lot of sort of multifunctionality, and really sort of trying to use green infrastructure as a way to deal with the water, but having multi-purpose functions as well. I'm just going to skip a little. The result in Copenhagen has basically been that this kind of planning has been done for the entire city. It has been converted into more than 300 individual projects across the city that will be built with a budget has been sort of allocated and agreed across the entire political spectrum that will be built over the next 10-15 years. So it's a process, but it's really sort of taking one, as we would say in Denmark, eat the elephant in small bites, and then try to really sort of get things done. So another example from some of the things we put in place, new squares where you then are able to sort of capture the water in the middle. We have renderings. These are some of some projects that have received a lot of prizes and recognitions. And in all of these cases, actually, a lot of emphasis has also been put in terms of involving the citizens in those local areas in terms of what they wanted out of the space. So very briefly, again, as you can see, starting in 2011, when we had the first sort of climate adaptation plan, and then we had the plan was actually just approved when we had these massive cloudbursts first in 2011, 2012, and that resulted then in the cloudburst management plan, and now here in 2000, last in 2015, the entire plan was approved for implementation, and Copenhagen is now implementing it. Very briefly on again back to the business case, which I think is very important, and this is one of the studies we did for Copenhagen, sort of very at a high level, illustrating in terms of climate adaptation planning that the cost of doing nothing is very high. As you look at sort of projections for sort of cloudbursts, massive rainfalls, and these kind of things, the climate change projections, we will see more and more of this, and that means that cost will just continue to grow if we do nothing. And again, I think one of the things that has been quite interesting in Copenhagen that we've worked with them with is really sort of looking at not only sort of doing your traditional cost analysis, but really looking at socio-economic parameters as well. How would this impact air pollution, real estate taxes in this city? In this case, it goes to the city. Insurance claims, real estate value, which we know will increase, from putting in place green and blue spaces, investment cost, operational cost, all these kind of things have to be factored into the case. So as I said, 300 plus projects over the next 15, 20 years, and $1.5 billion, more or less allocated going forward. I'm going to skip this. I just wanted to, I put this in there just to show that we've all, the same things that we have are now doing in Copenhagen, we've actually previously done in Singapore, and it's on a much larger scale over a much shorter time period. And I know that, for instance, in the US, this is how you've dealt with water in many urban settings, big concrete canals. And so this is an example from Singapore, from Bishan and Ramboll Park, where the canal, which used to be on the left side here, was demolished and turned into a natural landscape, basically connecting also the left side of the urban piece. All of the people living there, they could actually not access the park before because there was a big concrete canal, and now they have access to a beautiful urban space, but also were able to sort of capture the water and bring a lot of recreational value and urban nature back into sort of a very central part of Singapore. And it was done in 5 years' time, so very, very quickly. Some of the things we've been doing in Copenhagen, we're now doing in New York and also in Washington, D.C. So I think it is exportable. And I just want to sort of sum up by saying, I think, you really, if you want to address some of these things, climate change, it really, and this might not, this might not be rocket science, or it might be sort of self-evident, but it does require a lot of political courage, and it requires long-term planning, and it requires very clear priorities on many levels, from clear goals, strategic approach, financing, long-term public-private collaboration, and so forth. So it's not simple. But I think Copenhagen is a good example of how it's actually doable with very positive result. And I would say also, and I think this is very important to remember, and I think this is also, again, the mantra these days for a lot of urban planners, to remember, why is it that we're doing all of these things? Of course, it is to avoid having, our basements flooded, or to, reduce CO2 emissions, but it's ultimately to create better spaces for the people in the city, and focusing on livability and the human scale of things. So this guy, I think let's just drop him. I think it's sort of, I wanted to sort of incite a discussion, but I think I've taken up too much time in terms of livability and whether some of these things are in fact applicable in the US. So thank you very much.
Mette, we want to thank you, but maybe have time, as long as the Skype works, for you to respond to some of the queries or questions that our participants here tonight would like to ask you. But before they do that, just in case we get cut off, I have to.
Yeah, and I would say also, you have my email address. I'm very, you can also just shoot me emails, or people are welcome to give me a call. I can share my phone number and things like that with you afterwards. So, I have no problems with that.
Yeah, and just in case we get cut off, I can't thank you nearly enough for taking the time and talking to us about the livable city and what the 21st century should look like when we start developing our urban ecosystems. Your background is really impressive. We're going to be going to one of your alma maters in 4 weeks to Oxford, and your enthusiasm and competency in this subject is just overwhelming. With that, I want to thank you on behalf of Drake University, and then Jeff will have something to say as well. I cannot possibly share with you how important it is to deal with this issue of climate change. And we have in the United States, among some of our policymakers, people who are denying science. And that is putting the whole field of science in a crisis. With that being said, we'll entertain some questions from our group. Any questions or comments?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
Has Copenhagen faced any seriously measurable loss of shoreline in the last 30 or to 50 years?
Could you hear that question, Minnie?
No, not all of it. So maybe you can repeat, sorry.
Yeah, Mette, so the question was whether Copenhagen has experienced any serious loss of shoreline in the last 30 to 50 years. I don't know, is that
Yeah.
Yeah. Not seriously. I think the way Copenhagen is placed in a way, sort of a little bit sort of in the strait between, facing Sweden. We're not really in a place where you have massive surges the same way that you will find, in some coastal areas over here. We do have it in other parts of Denmark, but not really Copenhagen. But one of the things that we're actually looking at right now in Copenhagen is, how are we going to, because we know it will come, maybe not in the same way, but certainly with rising seawater levels. And I showed you some of the housing examples. You can see, there are housing that are built very close to the water. And we have some very expensive real estate. I mean, the Queen's Castle, for that matter, one of the other pictures, she has the harbor or the water just in her backyard, basically. So we will be affected by sea level rise if the projections that we are looking at now. So that's something that we are tackling right now, and we're working with the City of Copenhagen on that. And there we are looking at levies, different kinds of putting in place different kinds of what you call that, basically mechanisms that will shut off the inner harbor if you do have floods coming. So larger, I would say, engineering solutions as part of that also. But also in some of the, and this is not maybe in the very city center, because that you can in a way shut off in that way, but in some of the coastal areas, I think one of the differences that we have in general in Denmark is that the coastal areas you will find are to a very large extent less developed, in the sense that we have had for quite a lot of years very strict rules and regulations in place in terms of not building very close to the water, and almost all of the coastline around Denmark is public space, and there has been a lot of regulations that you cannot build very close to the actual sort of shore. So we have some different issues, but we are looking now, not only in Copenhagen but also across Denmark, in terms of how to protect the shorelines. The mechanisms applied are varied, and a lot of it is actually going back to again looking at what are the natural mechanisms of protecting shorelines. I think we're not to be honest, we're not as bad off as you will see it in some places across the US. For instance, I know, and this is probably not new to you, one of the reasons why you had such bad floodings in Louisiana several years back, and also now in Houston, is because all of the oil exploitation has basically reduced or completely obliterated some of the natural lands that were there and that would have served as barriers for storm surges coming in. So I think what we're looking at in Copenhagen and in Denmark is basically, at some of the more, going back to nature, basically, the natural mechanisms of protecting the land. I don't know if that answered. It's in process, I would say.
You might ask the group what they like as livable features.
Yeah, that would be interesting to hear what livability is, if there's something that resonates well.
Yeah. You do tell her the one thing we noticed about cities with a lot of bikes is they're quiet. It's really surprising.
There was a comment that the cities with a lot of biking, one of the benefits of it is how quiet the city is. So it addresses some of those noise pollution issues.
Yeah, I mean, and those of you who've been to Amsterdam will, also have experienced that, at least in the city center where you have virtually no cars. It does give a different sort of atmosphere altogether. So I think that's also, of course, something that I think is worth noting. One of the things that we are increasingly looking at in many cities is also pollution from light. Because there are a lot of studies that, or not a lot, but several studies that are now coming out confirming, how sort of excessive lighting have a negative impact on people's well-being. That you sort of are constantly, have non-natural light in your face, even at nighttime and when you sleep or try to sleep or whatever else it might be. So sort of the notion of light pollution is actually also rising on the agenda. But of course, traditional issues like air and noise are more what has, at least for the foreseeable future, a much greater impact on people's health altogether.
Other comments?
I was going to ask a question on how the car market is being affected by all the bikes being bought and used constantly.
What about the sale of automobiles? Is that affected in Copenhagen and in Denmark?
I think it's pretty stable. If you look at it statistically, there will be sort of some years goes up, some downs. But what you will probably find is, if you go to Denmark, is that the type of cars that we drive are very different from what you will see in most places over here. First of all, the cars generally are much smaller, and they will be, typically of a less polluting nature. This also has to do with tax policy in a way. Cars in Denmark are taxed between 200 and 300%. So just owning a car and driving a car is very expensive in general. So there's also, you could say, there's both a carrot and a stick mechanism in this. But we haven't gone. Actually, I would say, if you really want to look at places where they have really, moved ahead when it comes to sort of policies around cars or automobiles, Oslo and Norway is in a way, and I hate to say this, but they are taking over. They have by now the largest pool of electrical vehicles, I think per capita in the world, and they have very sort of very progressive policies around, turning the whole fleet of cars into electrical vehicles, and it's a lot of things from just in the city center, where they have a what do you call that? They have this sort of payment system that to enter the city you have to pay to
right?
yes, they have that. But if you have an electrical vehicle, it's free for you to enter the city. For instance, it's free for you to take all ferries across Norway. They have massively built out the charging system across all of Norway. So they are really aggressive in terms of turning the whole fleet of cars into electric vehicles, and they're looking at, and we're actually working, and that's a good thing. We're working with the city of Oslo on a lot of this, and also looking at sort of new modalities in terms of providing energy for transport and for bus fleets in a carbon neutral way and things like that. So modalities around taking excess heat from wastewater and then using it as a fuel on their buses and things like that. So some really innovative stuff. So that's kind of exciting. But so they're moving ahead really on the part of electrical vehicles much more than Denmark and Copenhagen is at the moment, at least.
Grace.
Is there do you charge an annual fee for the bicycles, like a registration fee?
No.
For a car?
No. Bicycles come in all, just as here, in all sort of shapes and prices. I think that one of the main things we have is that that people mostly complain of is sort of bike thefts, and the police simply don't have the capacity to investigate and follow up. So it's just sort of a rule of the land that if you own a bike, it will be stolen every once in a while, and that's just part of your maybe your operation and maintenance costs. So that's one thing. Another thing that I've heard people complain about is congestion on the bike lanes, and that might be a little bit of a luxury problem, some would say. But of course, it is an issue if you have a policy of really wanting to move people over to bikes. But so the city is constantly looking at ways to sort of try and build out the system as well.
What about the cost of housing in our livable city?
Yeah, I know that's a very big issue, obviously also here in the US. I mean, when I talk to cities, or even mayors that we sometimes meet up with and ask them what are the main problems or main issue that they face and they want to tackle, it is most often, affordable housing that comes up as like number one or number two. I actually think that it's also an issue in Copenhagen. We have 1,000 people moving into the city every month. That's been sort of a constant statistics over the last 10 years or so. So of course it puts a lot of pressure also on housing. We have a lot of students that cannot afford expensive housing and these kind of things. And a lot of the developments that have been done is on the upscale, but the city has also taken a quite active role in terms of providing affordable housing and putting in place codes and building codes sort of demanding that a certain percentage, similar to what you have here, but maybe more aggressively than in most US cities, that a certain large percentage of any new build area has to have a certain number of either student housing or other type of affordable housing. And then we have this mechanism of co-op housing, which is kind of interesting, where you have, and I think it's actually sort of a leftover from a lot of, from sort of unions, labor unions actually, that have these co-ops that will own very large building stocks or housing stocks across Copenhagen, and where they basically have as their main purpose to sort of have these buildings, maintain them, and make them available to people at sort of at a very affordable level. So there are some distinct mechanisms that are put in place to try really and address it. But I mean, we haven't solved it by we also have issues in terms of having enough affordable housing for sure.
Well, I think if there's one more, we'll take one more question. I know it's getting late where you're at, so is there another question for this evening? We got one more.
I noticed on our list they had burning wood as a source of energy. Do they have to import some wood?
The question is the source of your biomass for your biomass generation and cogeneration for your energy and district heating. Is the wood locally sourced, or where's it come from?
Some of it is, but actually, one of the issues that we have at the moment, to be honest with you, is that that there's been a lot of measures put in place in recent years across Denmark and also in Copenhagen, in terms of resource recycling and really separating just from households, for instance, separating waste streams and all these kind of things. So the effectiveness of waste and waste collection and separation and all these things have meant that the sort of the local biomass that we have is reduced. Some is being sourced still in Denmark, some is being sourced in Europe. But to be honest, we have actually also in recent years seen the pattern of for instance, sourcing biomass all the way from the US. And that is, of course, not super, sustainable if you have to transport it across the Atlantic Ocean to a place like Copenhagen to keep the cables boiling. So it is something that is being debated at the moment in terms of what is the best option here, and what is it again, looking ahead for the next 20, 30, 50 years, what is it that we need to be doing? So biomass is there, and it's been a way of converting from coal-fired power plants going over to biomass. But I don't think personally that it's going to be the end solution. I think we will try and see also with the sort of the new mechanisms coming into place in terms of battery storage and different ways of storing, because that's been one of our problems, so to speak, is that this sort of first generation that we have a lot of wind power, but of course it's very unstable, and the mechanisms for storing that energy has not been. It is improving, but there's still room to improve, and so you've had to have backup systems. And biomass has been one, but as we are getting less biomass locally and having to import it, for instance, from overseas, from the US, it becomes, in broader global terms, it might still be a good business case and a good case for Copenhagen, but in terms of sort of a broader picture, it's not necessarily the way to go forward.
So Mette, that's. Offline, that's something I actually would like to follow up with you on, since my agency houses the State Energy Office, and if in the last years adopted a state energy plan, I'd like to further discuss with you in the near future here the biomass opportunities with swine manure, which would be in quite a bit of use in Denmark, as well as the energy storage side, because we also have a large quantity of wind and a growing amount of solar. So I think we have some very similar situations there. So I'd like to explore that with you later. As well as just the civic engagement pieces of the work you're doing. But I think Dr. Meyer's got a closing comment here, and we'll let you go for the evening, and really appreciate all the time you've spent with us.
Mette, maybe sometime that you can come to Des Moines.
Yes, I would love to. I studied for, I don't know if you said that in your introduction, but I spent a year, I know it's not Des Moines, but it's not so far, in Nebraska, in a small town called Blair, Nebraska, outside of Omaha. I was there for a year after high school, so I like the area. I would love to come back again.
Yeah, by saying that you just made 100 friends.
Yeah, well, we see your Dubuque picture here at the end of your presentation, so you're close.
But in 1990, I came from another location to Des Moines, and someone asked me, what did I think about Des Moines? And I said, well, it's not too large and it's not too small, and it's nice. But I said, in reality, it's a dirty, old industrial city that's obsolete. 30 years later, it is completely revived. And the reason it is revived is because of public-private, nonprofit collaboration and cooperation. And in 1990, we got together and said there were 30 projects we wanted for Des Moines. Today, every one of them has been fulfilled at an extraordinarily high level. And we're using our water, we're developing middle housing, we're on the surge for economic development, we're combining all the synergies that the most creative class in America wants and where they want to live. So we would love to have you come to Des Moines and be able to show you around and tell you our story and learn more from you. On behalf of this group, I want to thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. And good night.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
Take care.
Take care.